Good afternoon, and welcome to this special program from the Alabama Department of Archives and History. My name is Steve Murray, and I am honored to serve as the 6th Director of the Archives. This institution was founded in 1901, the first such freestanding archival and historical agency to be created by a state government in the U.S. Today's program is marking an anniversary from another very important year, 1940, when the state of Alabama dedicated the original central portion of our magnificent building, a research facility and museum where generations of Alabamians have come to surround themselves with records and artifacts from the past. We think of it as the home of Alabama history, a place that belongs to and serves all the people of our state. Earlier this year, the Archives issued a statement of recommitment articulating the value we place on inclusive history. If you've not read it, I hope you will visit our website and spend some time with the statement. But please wait to do that after this hour's terrific lineup of speakers, each of whom was invited to share with you an important aspect of the legacy created 80 years ago this week. Jeff Jakeman is Professor Emeritus of History at Auburn University, where he was on faculty from 1992 to 2011. Prior to joining the Auburn faculty, he worked as an archivist here at the Department of Archives and History, at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, and at the Auburn University Archives. From 1996 until 2008, he served as editor of the Alabama Review. Early in that tenure, he hired a young graduate assistant and opened the door to the public history field to him. I have been grateful to have Jeff as a mentor and a friend ever since. Ruth Beaumont Cook is a graduate of The Ohio State University and lives in Birmingham. She is the author of 3 books. Her second book, Guests Behind the Barbed Wire, about the German POW camp in Aliceville during World War II, was awarded the Bronze Medal for Outstanding History Writing by the Independent Publishers Group. Today, she'll be sharing content from her third book, Magic in Stone, the Sylacauga Marble Story, which is available in our museum store. We will provide information on how you can order a copy in the comments below. Last but not least, Darren Moten is a professor of history and department chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Alabama State University. He holds a PhD and MA in American Studies from the University of Iowa and a master's in Library and Information Sciences from Catholic University of America. Darren is a former board member with the Friends of the Alabama Archives and a frequent researcher. Now, each of our guests will speak for up to 15 minutes today, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. You may type your questions in the comment field at any time during the program. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jeff Jakeman.
Thank you, Steve. Let me get this started here. Well, bear with me. I'm trying to get back to my, here we go. All right. So this talk is a condensed version of a longer essay that appeared in an anthology related to World War I. So if anything I say piques more interest and you want to read more about it, go to The Great War in the Heart of Dixie, and you can read the full essay there. In February 1919, 3 months after the end of World War I, Alabama became the first state to pass legislation to create a statewide memorial to honor those who fought in the Great War. The law established the Alabama Memorial Commission and directed it to raise funds for a memorial. The commissioners soon launched a $500,000 campaign for a memorial building on the state capitol grounds to house a state agency, the Department of Archives and History. Despite the state's early start, the project stalled and was not completed until 1940, as Steve mentioned in his introduction. At the dedication of the building in late 1940, the Archivist of the United States, R.D.W. Connor, paid tribute to this man, Thomas Owen. who founded the first state archives in 1901 and served as its director until 1920. Connor described the War Memorial Building as, quote, the capstone of Dr. Owen's work, and noted that, quote, his inspiration in the initial stages of the project brought it to a successful conclusion. Now, even though the south portico of the building bears the inscription Alabama World War Memorial, most Alabamians today would probably not identify the structure as a memorial to the Great War. Instead, the building is known as the State Archives or the Archives and History Building, and only incidentally at best as a war memorial. The building's failure to attain memorial status was not an unexpected development, at least to some Alabamians. Immediately after creation of the Memorial Commission, some citizens began to criticize the idea of erecting the building rather than a monument to honor the fallen. One critic asked pointedly, "Is there anything in a building that we can associate with the memory of our soldiers?" Nevertheless, the proponents of a memorial building proceeded under Owen's leadership, but achieving their goals proved difficult and slow. In addition to the complaints of critics, they encountered fundraising problems. A depressed agricultural economy and weariness from the sacrifices of the war made many Alabamians unable or unwilling to donate to the cause. Moreover, Owen's sudden death in 1920 at age 53 deprived the project of dynamic leadership. Although his successors continued the campaign, they raised scarcely a tenth of the $500,000 goal. They subsequently lobbied for state funding, but the onset of the Great Depression ended any hope of securing state dollars for the project. In the end, it was the infusion of federal money under the New Deal that brought the project to completion. The first proposal that Alabama's war memorial should take the form of a building came from a wartime agency, the Alabama Council of Defense. The council's final report recommended a memorial building to, quote, keep alive the records and exploits of those sons of Alabama who made the supreme sacrifice. Owen served on the council in his capacity as state war historian and almost certainly had a hand in shaping the recommendation. The Council of Defense's call for a building rather than a monument reflected a broader national trend of what were known as, quote, living memorials to the war dead. Proponents of living memorials argued that traditional monuments would lose their significance to subsequent generations. Instead, they advocated creating a facility, a building, a stadium, a park that not only honored fallen soldiers, but also served the needs of the living.
Jeff, excuse me, I'm sorry for interrupting you. Our viewers are not seeing your slides progress. I think, is your PowerPoint actually started?
Yes, you should be seeing a image of the cover of the council, the report of the Council of Defense.
Yeah, we're still seeing your title screen. I'm not sure.
Well, okay. I'm back to the title screen now.
And I think we're looking at a different screen on your window on your computer, maybe, because we're seeing the environment of Past Perfect or PowerPoint or whichever program you're using.
Okay.
Now, if you click there and progress through, I think we'll be able to see. We're seeing the.
So don't hit the display. Just leave the.
Try hitting your start to start the slideshow from there.
Yes.
See if.
Is it coming up?
No.
Huh. Okay. Well, if I do this, you're seeing.
Yes, that'll work fine. If you
Okay, we'll just go that way then.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, no problem. Glad you mentioned it. Okay, so you didn't see any of the slides. The previous, it just was an image of Owen, an image of the South Portico that shows the inscription Alabama World War Memorial, and now to the image of the Council of Defense report. So let's see. We were talking about at the national level that there was a group of 100 men and women who formed the National Committee on Memorial Buildings to foster this national movement to construct community buildings as living memorials. And by early 1919, some 400 cities and towns reported plans to erect community buildings as war memorials. But enthusiasm for these so-called Liberty buildings was not universal. In January 1919, the American Federation of Arts issued its recommendations for war memorials. The Federation acknowledged that buildings could serve as suitable memorials, but noted that a structure which is, quote, entirely utilitarian cannot satisfy the desire for a commemorative work of art. The Federation showed a clear preference for monumental memorials such as fountains, gateways, and tablets. Nevertheless, an influential cadre of state officials in Alabama embraced the idea of a Liberty building and began to move ahead decisively. In February 1919, the governor organized the Alabama Memorial Commission, consisting of 16 members, 5 ex officio, and 11 appointed by the governor. Owen was the only ex officio member who was not an elected official, a testament not only to his interest in the project's potential to create a facility for his agency, but also to his gravitas as a respected and influential figure in state government. He had directed the archives since its founding in 1901. He had served on at least 2 other commissions authorized by the state legislature, and in general, he was known as someone who could get things done in state government. Born in 1866, Owen earned a law degree in 1887. But by the early 1890s, he had developed a passion for Alabama history that eclipsed his legal career. In 1893, he married Marie Bankhead, daughter of John Hollis Bankhead, an experienced politician who became a leading member of Alabama's congressional delegation. Marie's brothers would later become influential leaders in Congress during Franklin Roosevelt's administration, and her niece Tallulah added glamour to the Bankhead name. In short, Owen had married into one of the most politically influential families in Alabama. By 1898, Owen's passion for history had become all-consuming, and he used his personal and family connections to establish a state agency devoted to Alabama history. When the legislature established the Alabama Department of Archives and History in 1901, Owen became its first director. Under Owen's leadership, the new agency rapidly developed despite its limited budget and the makeshift space it occupied in the state Capitol building. By 1907, Owen was appointed to the Alabama Capitol Building Commission, responsible for overseeing the expansion of the state capitol. And when the commission finished its work in 1911, the archives occupied a portion of the new south wing that was added to the Capitol building. By the onset of the Great War, Owen had developed the archives into a department of state government that served important administrative and cultural functions. The bill creating the Alabama Memorial Commission appropriated $50,000 toward the memorial, contingent on the commission raising at least $200,000 from private donations. Additionally, the act appropriated $10,000 immediately to underwrite the cost of the fundraising campaign. At its organizational meeting, the commission set an ambitious goal of raising at least $500,000, equivalent to over $6 million today. On April 3rd, the commission approved a resolution that specified the memorial would indeed take the form of a building on the state capitol grounds in Montgomery to house the state archives. In the weeks between the commission's organizational meeting and the April 3rd resolution, the commissioners had held various meetings to hear the views of the public regarding the state's proposed war memorial. The most significant opposition to a memorial building came from those promoting a memorial hospital for veterans and their families. Despite the strong statewide sentiment for such a hospital, the commissioners rejected the idea. Having stood firm on its decision regarding the nature and purpose of the memorial, the commission moved quickly to establish a framework for launching the fundraising campaign, and they recruited chairmen for each county. Sometimes the individuals approached had reservations about committing themselves to a statewide effort in the face of their community's interest in a local memorial. Some county chairmen, however, took up the work of the campaign with great enthusiasm. The Colbert County chairman, for example, reported that he would raise his quota of over $6,000 by July 4th, even though he, quote, met with some opposition among men of prominence whose support I had expected. Although Colbert County met its goal, despite local opposition, the situation was decidedly different in other counties. At the beginning of June, the Clark County chairman warned Owen of problems competing with churches. In the wake of the war, they had launched their own campaigns, and some ministers bluntly told their members to put donations to the church first and, quote, let the others go. By early June, the leader of the Clark County fundraising effort said that he would not meet his goal because the local economy was severely depressed. The situation was much the same in Franklin County. J. Mason Douglas, an attorney in the county, wrote Governor Kilby an impassioned 6-page letter urging postponement of the campaign. Douglas noted that he had served 2 years as an Army officer and spent 9 months in France until wounds sent him home. Thus, he wrote, I, quote, yield to no one in state pride or respect for the splendid accomplishments of Alabama soldiery. Nevertheless, he maintained that the current campaign was, quote, ill-timed and will be a burden to the people. Mines were closed and farmers were in danger of financial ruin because of flooding. Moreover, Douglas continued, the people of Franklin County had reservations about the project. According to Douglas, they, quote, do not understand what this memorial is to be. They know, of course, that it is to be a building, but such a memorial does not reach their hearts and imagination. Douglas concluded by urging the governor to postpone the campaign until the fall. He concluded with these words, if the dead could speak, they would not rush the people into a premature plan at a premature time. Well, Owen replied to critics who questioned the value of a memorial building in the state capitol by citing the examples of Westminster Abbey in England and Battle Abbey in Virginia. Like these sites, a war memorial building in Alabama, Owen predicted, would, quote, honor the men of this generation who shared in the great battles for world liberty. Despite Owen's confident rhetoric, the campaign faltered. The economic situation, weariness over war-related fund drives, and skepticism over the idea of a memorial building all proved daunting. But perhaps the most damaging blow was Owen's sudden death. Throughout 1919 and into the early months of 1920, Owen had worked incessantly to raise the funds for the project. He told one county chairman that he was incredibly busy because most of the commission's work fell to him. Nevertheless, he said he was, quote, willing to sacrifice everything for it. In March 1920, Owen dropped dead from a heart attack. The loss of his leadership and steady hand crippled the faltering campaign. Only a week after Owen died, the State Archives Board of Trustees selected his wife, Marie, to succeed him as director. And here is Miss Marie. Marie Bankhead Owen had suffered 2 devastating losses in March. At the beginning of March 1920, her father, Senator John Bankhead, had died, and by the end of the month, she was a widow. Despite her losses, she took up the work of her husband with great energy. She struggled to keep the campaign alive, but by 1924, she had abandoned hope that the effort would succeed. She subsequently placed her hopes in state government and told one county chairman, quote, the building will absolutely be erected at no distant date, as it is the memorial due to Alabamians who made such heroic sacrifices. Unfortunately, Marie's confidence was misplaced, for no appropriation came out of the 1924 legislative session. Her hope once again loomed large in 1927 when a bill was introduced to appropriate funds for the building, but it did not pass. Prospects that the state would fund the building perished with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. The year 1935 brought a new governor in Montgomery, Bibb Graves, who won with the support of a coalition of liberals, labor, and New Dealers. Graves quickly tapped into New Deal funding and launched a major building program for the Capitol complex. By the 1930s, Marie's brothers, John and William Bankhead, held influential positions in Congress and were key allies of President Roosevelt. And here is Senator John Hollis Bankhead II and his brother, William Bankhead, who was Speaker of the House. Consequently, Marie Bankhead was Owen was ideally positioned to work with the governor to obtain funding for an archives building, not from private donations or from the state, but from the federal government. Thus, despite the failed campaign, despite the long delay, despite the legislature's failure, Marie persevered and finished the project her husband had started. At one level, she clearly succeeded. Alabama had its World War I memorial, and the state archives had a magnificent facility. But the goal of erecting a memorial through the generous donations of Alabamians, flushed with patriotism and bursting with pride in the performance of their troops, proved elusive. Fund drive fatigue, crop failures, depressed economy, and Owen's sudden death all conspired against the plan. The plan to move quickly after the war and fund the project with private donations. It's true that Alabama ultimately obtained a magnificent building with the words Alabama World War Memorial engraved in large bold letters on the south portico. But for most Alabamians today, the building is less a memorial to the Great War and more a home to the state agency entrusted with preserving the state's historical treasures and promoting a better understanding of its history. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for that wonderful background of the creation and origins of the building. Next, we'll transition to Ruth Cook.
Thank you. I'm happy to be a part of this panel because the archives have been kind of a second home for me as a researcher in both the book Magic in Stone about the marble and of the state, and also in the book previously mentioned about the POWs in Aliceville. So the archives are very dear to me. What I want to focus on today is a little bit of background on the value of this resource, the marble in Sylacauga, and then on its relationship to the archives building. This first slide that you see here shows the original Gantz quarry, which is now, that quarry is dormant, but that's right out of Sylacauga. And to the left, you see a sculpture that I think embodies the whole concept of, you have the raw marble there on the outside, and then Dale Liner's creation of the heart of Sylacauga, which marble definitely is, and how beautifully it's sculpted and polished out of that stone. So a little bit of background, you can see this is a geological map that was created back in the 1950s, showing where the Sylacauga marble deposit is. I think a lot of people don't realize how large this resource is. It's 32 miles long between Cohatchee Mountain and Talladega Rebecca Mountain in Talladega County. It's approximately 400 feet deep. And at its widest point near Sylacauga, it's 1.5 miles wide. So it is a huge resource. Alabama marble, or Sylacauga marble, has been compared throughout history to two other sources in the world that have this same cream-colored crystalline marble, which has a great strength to it. The first of those is the island of Paros off the coast of Greece. You see a photo of it up there at the top. And as early as 1868, Julia Tutwiler knew that Alabama's marble was compared to that at Paros when she wrote Alabama. In the second verse of that, one of the quotations is, "From the quarries where the marble white as that of Paros gleams." And of course, the Parian marble is what was used in the statue of Nike that you see there. The second place where Alabama marble is often compared to is Carrara in Italy, which is near the city of Pietrasanta. And I like to say that this is where, when Michelangelo had a new commission, that's where he went shopping for his marble. And you can see his concept there, which I also like to quote. "I saw the angel in the marble, and I carved until I set him free." And this is really what sculptors see when they look at a big chunk of marble. Now, The marble in Sylacauga and that in Carrara are geologically very similar, but they're quarried in different ways. You can see on the left that in Carrara, it's in the side of a mountain that has heaved up. So it's a little easier to get to than in Sylacauga, where that whole deposit is below ground and they have to go down to get to it. It was not until September of 1969 that the Alabama legislature adopted Act number 755, naming marble as the official state rock of Alabama. But the history of marble in this state goes far, far back before that. The earliest awarenesses of marble as a resource were in the late 1700s, the early 1800s. But it was this man on the left, Giuseppe Moretti, who was the first that really promoted Alabama marble as a world-class resource for architecture, for sculpture, and later for industrial uses. He came to Alabama originally in 1904 from Italy, or actually he came from New York, but he was originally from Italy. But he had been commissioned by the Commercial Club in Birmingham to create a cast iron sculpture to represent Birmingham's iron and steel industry at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, which was held in St. Louis, Missouri in 1904. And you can see Vulcan inside the metallurgy building at that exposition. Vulcan was awarded a gold medal in that competition. But many Alabama people are not aware that Moretti took with him to St. Louis another entry for that exposition. And that was what you see on the right. It was a carving of the head of Christ meant to depict him in repose and at peace after the crucifixion. This was the piece of the sculpture that Moretti cherished most among his creations during his life as a sculptor. He had discovered the Sylacauga marble quarries shortly after he came to Birmingham through a man named John H. Adams, who was a mining engineer. And he brought back to Birmingham several large chunks of the marble and created this piece that you see on the right. It also won a silver medal in St. Louis. Now, you've already heard the history of the building of the archives building. When it was finally constructed, the walls of most of the building are created from the cream-colored soft marble from Sylacauga. And you can see the top illustration there shows one of the lobby walls with that marble there. It's very sturdy, even when it's sliced thin enough to be used as a facade as it is there. Also within the archives building, on both the first and second floors, there are marble pillars, solid marble, Alabama marble pillars, as you can see on the left in the bottom photograph, created from Alabama marble. And they are placed on Tennessee marble bases. It's interesting to note that there was a little bit of controversy when Moretti died. He had willed this sculpture of the head of Christ to his wife, and that was in the official papers. But when he died in January of 1935, as you just heard, Marie Bankhead Owen had become the director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And she wrote to Moretti's wife, who at that time was living in Boston. No, she was still in Italy at that point. They had, the Morettis and their assistant, Geneva Mercer, had returned to Italy in the 1920s when he was in bad health, and they were living in San Remo. But Marie Bankhead Owen wrote to Dorothea Moretti and said, "I hope it can be arranged in some way for us to receive," meaning the archives, "this gift from a man who loved Alabama and at one time made this state his home." But there was a little bit of controversy over that, because also in the 1930s, the Birmingham Birmingham Chamber of Commerce and other groups had finally rescued Vulcan from his ignominious vacant lot out by the fairgrounds and built Vulcan Park and set up the pedestal that you see there to put the cast iron statue of Vulcan on top of. John Adams, who was a good friend of Moretti, had directed that the inner walls of that pedestal be created from Sylacauga marble. And if you go inside that spiral staircase area, you can see the beautiful marble displayed there as well. But they were determined that that head of Christ should be displayed with Vulcan in Birmingham, and they said that they thought that that was what Mr. Moretti had intended in the first place. But Mr. Adams assured them that no, he had left the sculpture to his wife, and that her preference was clearly to place the head of Christ in the new archives building, the new World War Memorial in Montgomery. So there was a little bit of back and forth about that. But in October of 1940, Geneva Mercer, who was Moretti's longtime artistic assistant from Marengo County here in Alabama, and his wife, Dorothea, shipped Giuseppe Moretti's head of Christ to the Alabama Department of Archives on October 28th, 1940. And in the photo at the left, you can see the woman on the left is Geneva Mercer, who was quite a sculptor and an artist in her own right as well. Giuseppe Moretti in the middle, and his wife, Dorothea, on the right. That photograph was taken in Florence shortly after they moved to Italy. And when Dorothea had the sculpture sent to the archives, this is the statement that she wrote that accompanied it. It is precisely as the pioneer of Alabama marble that Moretti is commemorated in the archives and history of the state. It is precisely in order that future generations will know when they see those magnificent columns, she's referring to the ones inside the first and second floor lobbies, that the artist Moretti was the first moving force that, in his phrase, brought that beautiful marble to the light. So it was very clear that she wanted this sculpture to be displayed, as it still is, in the archives building rather than up there with Vulcan. Now, when it was dedicated in 1941, this is the memorial that Dorothea Moretti wrote with the help of John Adams. And she said of her husband, who divided his great love for sculpture with affection for our state by giving freely of his means and profound knowledge of earth's hidden treasures, by tireless research and work in the practical development of one of its greatest mineral resources, the marble of Alabama. This head of Christ was carved by him in 1904 and presented to the people of Alabama in 1941 by his wife, Dorothea. And I know that his family was quite pleased that it was to appear in the archives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. We are indeed honored to have provided a home for that beautiful sculpture since 1941, and you can see it on the third floor of the building today. Up next is Dr. Darren Moten. Darren?
Thank you, Steve. I want to express my appreciation for being invited to participate on this panel. I'm happy to be with or join Jeff and Ruth in this discussion. My talk today is really more of a reflection based on my living in Alabama for 24 years, being a frequent researcher at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, and also my research and writing on matters relative to African Americans in Alabama and in the United States. And so some of you may recognize my title from a speech that Dr. King gave at the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March, where, among other things, he said, "Truth pressed the earth will rise again." But he also said that no lie can live forever. And so I titled my presentation this because I want to talk about what's not often discussed when we talk about Alabama history. I'm happy Jeff talked about the building, the Alabama Department of Archives and History building being a memorial to World War I. However, I wonder how many people who walked into that building know the history of Black men and women who participated in World War I. And their participation was not insignificant. This was the first war where Black men were drafted into military service. This was the first war where the United States government created two battle divisions, segregated battle divisions, the 92nd Division and the 93rd Division. The 93rd Division was known as the Buffalo Division. This was the first war where a Black civilian by the name of Emmett J. Scott was made the special assistant to the Secretary of War for Negro Troops. Emmett Scott was the longtime secretary for Booker T. Washington. And Washington certainly, before his death in 1915, had a hand in Scott's selection. Emmett Scott is important because he also wrote the first comprehensive history of Black soldiers in World War I. And anybody, I believe, who's interested in knowing that history has to read Emmett Scott's book. After he returned from his service in World War I, Scott subsequently ended up at Howard University. So Jeff has already mentioned the fact, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Jeff has already mentioned the fact that about the term of service for Dr. Thomas Owen and Marie Bankhead Owen. Between the two of them, they directed the Alabama Department of Archives and History for nearly 60 years, from 1901 until 1955, when Mrs. Owen retired. The Alabama Department of Archives and History was often thought of as the mine of the state. Mrs. Bankhead Owen is also, she's also, I'm struggling because I don't want to say famous, but she is recognized for another accomplishment, and that is the state motto. And I often ask my students when we talk about this, how many of them are queried my students, how many of them actually know the state motto. Many don't, and I tell them every time they stop at an Alabama rest area, they walk right past it. But the state motto is, "We dare defend our rights." And this motto was adopted in 1923, was approved by the Alabama legislature in 1953, and it's been adopted by various organizations. We know why Mrs. Owen chose that motto. We know where she found it. We don't know, or I should say I don't know, what she was thinking when she made that selection. We do know that, as I said, various organizations over the years have adopted this. And we do know that that the reading of these words conjure up different ideas for these different organizations. We know that in 1956, or let me start with 1904. In 1904, well, let me start in 1956. In 1956, the Segregation Party adopted the motto when it filed credentials with the Alabama Secretary of State. We also know that there were other organizations that adopted this motto. There was the state legislature, well, the Republicans for the state legislature in 1973 used this as their mantra, that is, we dare defend our rights. And I go back to, what Dr. King talked about in his speech in Montgomery in 1965, when he talked about, truth pressed to earth will rise again, and that no lie shall live forever. And when I think about the state motto for Alabama, we dare defend our rights, I often ask myself the question, who's we and what are our rights? And I found a 1950 Montgomery Advertiser editorial, and it's on the screen right now, and it says, how appropriate for men and women to stand firmly in defense of a time-honored rights, or of the time-honored rights of the state against encroachments of outsiders who want to run our internal affairs. Now, I'm not exactly sure what or who in particular the advertiser was referring to when they talked about encroachments or outside encroachments, and people who wanted to run the internal affairs of the state. But we do know what was going on in the world and what was going on in the South in the 1950s. We do know that that the NAACP had started in the 1930s, actually litigating cases that subsequently led to the Supreme Court decision in May 1954, Brown v. Board, which ruled that segregated schools were in violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Don't know if that's what the editorial board for the Montgomery Advertiser was alluding to, but it's possible that could have been the case. We do know that there's been a lot of angst, not only in Alabama, but in other former Confederate states, about the federal government encroaching on the rights of people in these states. And so I think about the inaugural address of Governor Wallace in 1963, when he talked about tossing the gauntlet to the feet of tyranny. He was talking about the tyrannous government, of course, in Washington, D.C. And when he talked about or took a vow or made a vow of segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. I mentioned this anxiety that Southern politicians had about outside encroachment. This anxiety had a lot to do with what precipitated the Civil War, the causes of the Civil War, and when I applaud Steve in the Alabama Archives Board for its recommitment and for its sort of examination of these matters, because I think these topics are things that we have to talk about, and so this idea of what were the causes of the Civil War, what caused the Civil War, is still a polemical topic, and primarily in the South, but not exclusively in the South. And so the idea of whether or not the South fought the war for the perpetuation or for the continuation of slavery is a contentious topic, except that, you know, we know if one looks at the Confederate Constitution, which was drafted in Montgomery, Alabama, and if we take into consideration that Alexander Stephens, who became vice president for the Confederate government, was charged with overseeing the drafting of that Constitution. We know that in that Constitution, it says that the Confederate Congress shall pass no laws, basically subverting or preventing the expansion of Negro slavery into the Western Territories. And I like the fact that it says Negro slavery, because I think unlike the federal Constitution, the Confederate Constitution, or the framers of the Confederate Constitution, wanted us to be clear about what type of slavery they were referring to. And that is, it was Negro slavery. And so, as I say here on this screen, that the Civil War became a self-fulfilled prophecy, that President Abraham Lincoln had said that a house divided cannot stand, a country cannot be part slave and part free. I also put here that the lost cause became a double entendre, that Blacks, that is the 4 million that were freed after slavery, or I should say after the Civil War, were not confused or conflicted about the cause of the Civil War. Neither was Frederick Douglass. I mean, Frederick Douglass had even asked the question, if war among whites brought peace and liberty to Blacks, what will peace among whites bring? And so that's a question that I think we're still are wrangling with. I mentioned the other organizations that adopted the state motto as their crest or as their mantra. And one was, in a manner of speaking, the Alabama Democratic Party, which had as its emblem a white rooster and had as its motto white supremacy. And here is an ad I found in a newspaper where it asked if individuals were interested in making the Alabama Democratic Party a white party. And you can see the rest. And so some may not know that when the Lowndes County Freedom Organization took shape, that one of the reasons why the organizers of that freedom organization selected a Black Panther as its symbol is because, at least according to folklore, that a Black Panther eats roosters. Here is a headline from an Alabama newspaper Democrats are urged to mark their ballot under the rooster. And I mentioned Alexander Stephens, former Georgia congressman. And I include this portion of his cornerstone speech to speak to this whole notion of white supremacy and white superiority. And he says that, or said in that speech, basically he said that the old government was founded upon the false premise that all men are created equal. And he writes here that our new government is founded on the opposite idea. Its cornerstones rest upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. 63 years ago this week, the Association for the Study of Negro Life met in Montgomery, Alabama. This is the organization, I'm sure as many of you know, was founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. That meeting was largely held on the campus of Alabama State College. There was a session on Thursday, November the 14th, the first day of that meeting. That included a staff member from the Alabama Department of Archives and History. That panel discussed sources for the study of the Negro. And so 63 years ago, there were historians and scholars and researchers who assembled here in Montgomery and had a discussion with staff from the Alabama Department of Archives and History about sources for the study of the Negro. Among those individuals was Dr. John Hope Franklin. And I was fortunate enough to have met Dr. Franklin when he came to speak at Alabama State, now University. He was a good friend of President William H. Harris. John Hope Franklin is named after the famous college president and intellectual, Black intellectual, John Hope. In his book, and this is the reason why I included a portion of this article, Mirror to America, he talks about an encounter that he had with the director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History, Marie Bankhead Owen. Dr. Franklin wanted to use the papers of Governor Winston. Those papers had not been processed. He was told that he would need to get the permission from Ms. Owen in order to use the papers. He was escorted to her office. He met with her. And he says, and you can read this in his book, it's on pages 121 through 122. As he was walking out the door, Ms. Owen said to Dr. Franklin, "I hear there is a Harvard Negro," although she did not say Negro, "here in the library." And Dr. Franklin said he froze. And he said he was dumbfounded. He didn't really know how to respond. He said the secretary for Ms. Owen heard the conversation or heard the question, and from her station said or answered back to Ms. Owen, "That's him." And so, Dr. Franklin, I've heard him talk about this during interviews, joke about, or I should say chuckle about it, but it sort of speaks to the work that I think we need to do to, as Steve says, to be more inclusive, to be more sensitive, And the archives is a wonderful resource. There are materials there that reveal all kinds of new understandings about the history of this state. But we have to, and this is part of the work that I see for myself as an educator, we have to encourage students to sort of plumb that work for these nuggets, for these answers. As I said earlier, I'm not sure why Marie Bankhead Owen selected We Dare Defend Our Rights. I do know that that when I pass that sign, generally when I'm at a rest area, I am always struck by the words because I question whether or not the Blacks in this state were part of the plural we. And I also question whether or not the rights that are referred to as in We Dare Defend Our Rights were the rights of all Alabamians. This may have made sense in 1923 and 1953. I really do question whether or not it makes sense in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren, and thank you to all three of our speakers. We have a few minutes. Encourage you, if you have a question for any of our speakers, to put that into the comment box on the screen, and we'll be happy to pass that along to them. I had a couple of thoughts that I just wanted to share in response to these wonderful presentations that we've had today, and starting with Dr. Moten's comments, which I think point to an extremely important point that we've been reflecting on quite a bit here at the archives. It's not newly this year, but in a more focused way, I would say, this year. And when we talk about the legacies of the Owens, and we're talking, you can't really separate them in some respects because Tom was so important in getting the agency started and setting its direction and its mission. But Marie, whom we're focusing on today in conjunction with the building that opened in 1940, and I tell you, Alex, if you'll go ahead and just put the speakers back up on the screen so we can all see each other. There's no way to ignore the fact that Marie's legacy is a complex one, and her role in Alabama society had such important impact socially, politically, and what was happening in Alabama during the time. And even as this building was under construction between 1938 and 1940 was when she was successfully lobbying the legislature to displace the Reconstruction era state seal and to adopt or to restore the state seal that had been in use before the Civil War, and also to adopt for the first time the state's coat of arms. And that coat of arms is where that state motto originates that Dr. Moten was talking about, of We Dare Defend Our Rights. And I think there's no question about the origin of her intention there, and the fact that Marie Owen was thoroughly unreconstructed as a white Southerner, and she embodied the values of white Southerners, white Alabamians at the time, and its adherence to white supremacist thinking and its use of policy to maintain that supremacy as it existed in Alabama government and society at the time. That leaves for us a difficult challenge to think about both the contributions that she was making as well as the troubling legacy, not just for what it means about who she was at the time, but the long-term consequences of what that meant in terms of our ability as an agency to serve all Alabamians and to support serious scholarly research in African American history, for example. So there's a paradox here that's really interesting, and I appreciate the way that all three of you brought this components of this paradox to the table. The intensive work spanning decades to memorialize the lives and service of Alabamians who died in World War I. The effort that Marie was just not willing to let that go. It would have been easy to let go of Tom's vision over those 20 years after his death, but she refused to do that, and then brought in Ruth during that. When you think about this span from 1939 to 1941, it was the head of Christ, and it was this magnificent Sylacauga marble paneling that was installed throughout the building, but it was also the Kittrick Hiker that was dedicated in 1940, and the vine and olive wallpaper that's still installed on the third floor, just around the corner from the head of Christ that came to the building in 1940. All of these things that are iconic to us today were coming in at the same time that she was promoting from a position of racism, this work in installing new state symbols that worked to deny the efforts of African Americans and their allies to advance and to do anything to celebrate the embrace of freedom and the advancement of the rights of African Americans in Alabama. So that's something that's on our minds very much these days. I'm going to be speaking next month about Tomoan, more particularly, from this perspective during our monthly Food for Thought series, and we will reflect on that a little bit more. There's another theme here, and I'd love for any of you to jump in with reflections on this at any point, but another theme that comes to mind in terms of persistence is the persistence of vision for the structure itself. As Jeff said, this was originated from from an early design right after World War I, and they were very faithful. And Alex, if you don't mind putting that image back up, in over the years, retaining the architect's original vision for what this building was supposed to be. So they only had enough resources to build that central portion between 1938 and 39, but they went ahead and designed and built the front terrace in a way that would accommodate the future additions of the flanking wings. That wouldn't happen until the 1970s for the East Wing, and then 2005 for the West Wing. But there was a long-term vision that was maintained, that those of us who are here today who weren't present and didn't carry that burden of fidelity to that original vision, we're certainly grateful that preceding generations did. Most recently, Ed Bridges, when he was director here, and making sure that the West Wing helped to flesh out that original vision. We've got a couple of questions in the for our panelists. Let me pose one of these. For Ruth, can you talk about any other buildings in Alabama that might have a comparable amount of Sylacauga marble, or are we unique in that way?
No, not at all. I'm most familiar with Birmingham, and the Brown Marks building, which is recently being renovated, has a great deal of marble. Also, the Lyric Theater, all of the floors inside of that are Alabama marble. And then there are two buildings, one in Mobile and one in Birmingham, that unfortunately were destroyed a few years before people became so interested in preserving historical buildings. One of those is the main post office in Mobile, and the other is the incredibly beautiful railroad depot in Birmingham, which was almost entirely marble inside from Sylacauga. And just quickly beyond that, a large part of the interior of the United States Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. is Sylacauga marble, including the 16 pillars outside the Supreme Court chamber. And the ceiling, I was told that the Lincoln Memorial was Sylacauga marble, but that's not correct. But the ceiling above the statue of Abraham Lincoln is, because it cut both ends and made translucent. So there's more examples.
Thank you. Another question is about a little more, Jeff, about this concept of living memorials. And really for any of you, all of you have can perhaps speak to this, but this idea of what a living memorial is and how it functions.
Well, well, you hear all quite frequently about Memorial Stadium and this term, and typically those refer back to the post-World War I period. Off the top of, I think there has been some research done on this, but off the top of my head, I'm not pulling it out. I can check my bibliography. It's been a number of years since I did this research. And it seems to me that there were a couple of sources at the time that I came across, and probably in the 10 or 12 years since I did the research, there may have been some additional work along those lines. Probably not the answer you're looking for, but I can do a little digging and see if I can follow up with the questioner after the meeting and pass along some information.
It's certainly one that has relevance today and in this year when we've seen existing memorials modified through public action, and I'm thinking specifically of those examples in Richmond, where through protest there have been this revisioning of some monuments, some of which have been taken down since then. But I think it's an interesting discussion as we talk about how we design and install memorials today, what that should look like and what that means, especially as we have, I think, a better understanding of how our memorial intent can evolve over time.
I will say that one more comment about the idea of living memorials. It was pretty much a U.S. phenomenon. In Europe, it was all about monuments and statuary and fountains and the things that the American Federation of Art was really trying to promote here in the United States. I attributed that to the fact that the war was so much more traumatic to the Europeans, the loss of life, the length of time. So they were not interested in anything that didn't served only one purpose. They were not interested in this. Well, we'll serve two purposes: for the living and for the dead. In their view, it was all about remembering and honoring the dead. And I think one more point, picking up what you were saying, Steve, is it's very easy to pull down a statue if you disagree with the cause or the person that's honoring. It would be much more difficult to pull down and destroy a living memorial that has been used for many, many purposes beyond the memorialization of whatever it was intended to memorialize. So I don't recall that there's been any, in the events of the last year, any effort to try to destroy a building. It's more focused on statues and that sort of thing.
Good. Thank you, Jeff. Ruth, another quick question for you that comes to mind. This came up in conversation, as it does periodically, about Sylacauga marble today and whether it is being used for architectural purposes. And could you say a word about the industrial and commercial uses of marble in recent decades, and or can we expect to see it in new installations as part of other buildings?
Very good question. A little bit of background. It was in the 1930s that the architectural use of marble began to wane because of industrial pollution. And it was found that granite for outdoor installations was much more effective. And so the two main companies at that time in Sylacauga, Moretti-Hara and the Alabama Marble Company, began to look for other uses for the marble. And that was when it's called GCC, or ground calcium carbonate, became an industrial resource for Alabama. You may not know automatically what GCC is, but if you open a chewing that little powder all over, keep it from sticking, that's GCC. If your bread is fortified with calcium, it probably came from the quarries in Sylacauga. It's in paper coatings, it's in paint thickeners, all kinds of things. And it is a huge asset financially for Sylacauga now. There are major companies there doing it. But for me, the theme kind of behind the book, Magic in Stone, rather, is the story of how the architecture and the art went down. And then when the State Council on the Arts had the sister celebration of Pietrasanta, the whole state of Alabama and the city of Pietrasanta in Italy in 1989, I believe it was. After that, Sylacauga began to have its marble festival every year. And they now bring sculptors from all over the country once a year. Unfortunately, this year, like everything else, it was canceled. But they have a resident sculptor, Craig Brown, who has done several installations around the state. And they're teaching sculpture. And it is used more and more for interior architecture in this period of time.
Great, thank you. And another use that is we continue to see Sylacauga marble show up is in sculpture, and we've got
That's right.
some wonderful recent additions to the landscape. Another one that is going to be dedicated in just a few weeks is of a new World War I memorial carved from Alabama marble that's going at Mortimer Jordan High School. And our good friend Craig Brown in Sylacauga, one of the wonderful sculptors there, is working on that piece, and I think it's being installed just about now and will be unveiled
It's
shortly.
beautiful. And the the Italian sculpture that's in the outdoor sculpture garden at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. I think it's called the Way Luna. Have you seen that? See it at night. It's lit up. And then he also did what's the name of it? The Warmth and Enlightenment, which is Helen Keller and her teacher up at Ivy Green in Tuscumbia. So yes, definitely sculpture is important.
Absolutely. I want to close with one last point, circling back around to Dr. Moten and the idea of living memorials. Darren has me thinking about this and the state motto, and just as symbols like the American flag and monuments have been interpreted and used by different movements throughout our history to convey different messages, I've thought, and certainly not the first to think this is not original to me, but the idea that phrase, "we dare defend our rights," can have multiple meanings and really be kind of turned from another perspective when you think about the incredibly strong protest tradition in Alabama, where it's not just the state in the era of segregation protesting outside agitators and federal intrusion, but it's those grassroots Alabamians, also daring to defend their rights. And I wonder, what do you think about that? Is there enough malleability in that phrase that it might have a different kind of life and use?
I think so, but I think we have to sort of talk about the multiple ways in which the phrase is interpreted. And, I have yet to have a class or any student in a class of mine to believe that she or he was included in the "we" or our rights. I think that's very telling. And these students come from all over the country. And so, yeah, I think we need to, there's just no one way in which we can interpret this given the history of the state. I think it's impossible to talk about the model of the state without talking about the history of the state.
Absolutely. Well, we are past 1:15. Let me thank all of you again for a fantastic program. We appreciate your involvement in this most unusual of years. I would love to have had you all here in person. I'll remind our viewers that the museum remains closed. We do have researchers coming in by appointment, and you can find information on that about that on our website. Also encourage you to look at Alabama History at Home. It's a resource that we put up back in late March to support Alabamians as they adjust to life spent mostly at home during the pandemic. It's got wonderful resources, including recordings of other online programs going back years. And you can learn more. Probably all of three of these speakers appear somewhere else in that big library of recorded programs that we have. Again, thank you all so much, and we hope that you all stay safe and look forward to a better and brighter 2021. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Take care.